So when we think about the treatments that have been used for psychiatric illnesses through the years, they're pretty scary, ranging from frontal lobotomies, where holes were drilled into the skull and they were prodding around in the brain, to induced comas, shock therapies, institutionalization. None of that sounds like something any of us want to go through. So when we discovered that we could potentially take a pill to correct or help with psychiatric or mental illness, that was very exciting, because that was so much less invasive and painful and scary than some of those other techniques. And pills that have chemicals and can cross our blood-brain barrier when we swallow the pill, or this is infused in our body in some way, and goes into our brain, it can change the neurochemistry of our brain. So it makes perfect sense when we think about the way neurons interact. So we have so many of these wonderfully complex neurons in our brain, something like 86 billion. And these neurons talk to other neurons. And this is called a synapse. And the way the neurons talk to each other is through chemicals. So it makes perfect sense that we may be able to manipulate the chemicals that are exchanged in this synapse when neurons are talking to one another. Maybe we have two what we call terminal endings here, and these neurotransmitters float across the synapse, and they're received on this side with very specific receptors. So we're on seemingly the right path. If we're thinking about a disorder such as depression, and depression is one of the most prevalent psychiatric illnesses, about 17% of us throughout our lifetime at some point will be diagnosed or meet diagnostic criteria for depression. Across the world, some 300 million people suffer from this disorder. So it's certainly something that we need to think about treating. It causes so much loss and so much pain. One of the neurochemicals that has been implicated with depression is serotonin. And so serotonin is one of these neurochemicals. It's involved in mood regulation, but also a lot of other things like sexual behavior, hunger, temperature regulation, aggression. And there are other neurochemicals such as dopamine, involved in rewards or telling us when something is important, or glutamate, which is an excitatory neurochemical that's involved in learning. And the list goes on, but it makes perfect theoretical sense that we may be able to alter the chemistry of our brain that will alter symptoms. However, with depression and the antidepressants that have been so popular, the results haven't been incredibly exciting. So the research usually has an experimental group that takes the drug, and then a placebo group that gets an inactive drug, so it doesn't influence the neurochemistry. So the most popular type of drug for depression is known as an SSRI, and this is what Prozac is. So a selective serotonin. Serotonin is the neurochemical that has received the most attention. Reuptake inhibitor. So it's going to keep serotonin in this synapse so that it's communicating with the other neurons for a little bit longer before it takes it back up. So it's going to block that reuptake. So that's great. So if individuals are given an SSRI or a placebo, within about 2 months, and you're tracking how many people are getting better, about 40 to 60% will get better within that 2 months' time taking the SSRI or the antidepressant, whereas about 20 to 40% will get better if they take placebo or maybe even nothing. So there are these cycles. So this is obviously something to be excited about. Maybe an extra 20% of people are going to feel better. However, there is still not perfect in the sense that there are side effects, because serotonin, I mentioned that it influences a lot of different behaviors. Some people are on these for long time periods and they may never get back to fully functioning the way they were before. So there are some problems with this, and it would be great to get more people back to where they were with the treatments that we have for depression. So we're on the right track thinking about the brain and neurochemistry. But in addition to neurochemistry, what about brain areas that are implicated in depression? So if we look at the human brain, and think about the symptoms, kind of go back to the drawing board and look at the symptoms of depression. One of the signature characteristics of depression is this lack of an ability to experience pleasure or reward. And there's an area of the brain known as the nucleus accumbens that processes reward, or at least, and tells us when something is important that we need to be paying attention to. And so this nucleus accumbens, it's interesting that it talks to an area of the brain known as the striatum. And the striatum is involved in movement. So we've got pathways from the nucleus accumbens that may be influencing reward and satisfaction and pleasure, talking to an area of the brain that's involved in movement. What's that movement? We usually don't think about movement when we're thinking about thoughts and emotions and treating depression. But a big part of our brain is involved in movement. This huge area in the center, the cerebellum, that's involved in coordinating movement. And most of our neurons, like 78% of the cells in our brain, are in the cerebellum. And we have a motor strip that is involved in helping us move our muscles. So a lot of our brain is involved in movement, and the nucleus accumbens that may be affected in depression is communicating with the striatum. So it makes you think that maybe movement could be, and other areas of the brain could be implicated in depression. If we think about taking this to the lab, there's a training, a protocol that we use in the lab known as effort-based rewards. I've spoken about this a lot. And we wanted to see if we could build connections between the pleasure area, the reward-seeking area, and the movement area by training some rats to produce effort, to exert effort in order to get their rewards. So we're building these connections. So we have some rats that are digging in mounds to get Fruit Loops, and we call these the worker rats. And some rats that don't have to work for their food, and we call these the trust fund rats. We just give them the Fruit Loops, they don't have to dig for them. So we think that we're enhancing and building this connection between reward and movement in the worker or contingent trained rats, and we're not doing that for the trust fund rats. So next we want to give them a challenge task to see if they're more motivated to work on this task. So we give them this little plastic cat ball that has plastic, and we hide a Fruit Loop in it. Not hide, they can see the Fruit Loop, but they can't get it out. They put their little paws in this plastic cat ball and they pick it up and they try to get that Fruit Loop. And all the rats do that. The worker and the trust fund rats do that. But the worker rats will persist longer, as if they have more confidence and made more connections related to actually being motivated to get that reward. And that seems to be something that may be building resilience against the symptoms of depression. And stress hormones are also lower in these trained rats, where we're building connections between effort and rewards. effort-based rewards instead of rewards just dropping down and being given to you. So maybe thinking about movement and activating certain areas of the brain involved in reward and decision making and the neurochemicals will give us a better chance of treating and having a drug that helps more than 40 to 60% of the people. And thinking about dopamine, which I mentioned is involved in reward and certainly part of this nucleus accumbens area or circuit, there's some interesting research where rats are given a choice, like they have an alley, kind of like a tea maze, and they have several treats. We'll just keep saying Fruit Loops, and Fruit Loops are the currency of the rats in my lab. They love to work for Fruit Loops. So if we have at the end of one arm we have several Fruit Loops, at the end of another we just have one. But the trick is that there are some barriers in this arm. So the animal has to jump these barriers. It's harder work to get to the reward. Here you just walk straight to the reward. So we may consider this one Fruit Loop the low-hanging fruit loop, and you have to work harder for it. Well, if you compromise the nucleus accumbens and dopamine areas of the brain, the animals are less likely to go for the big payoff and more likely to go for the easy payoff. But healthy, intact animals that have had richer experiences, or at least an intact dopamine system, they're going to work harder to go for the big rewards. So in addition to serotonin and taking pills to influence our neurochemistry, thinking about lifestyle and movement and the context of that neurochemistry may give us some better clues about how to treat depression more effectively. If we think about a task that humans engage in, such as knitting, so maybe we have been knitting a hat, cute little fluffy hat here. So knitting involves effort, and where you're moving your hands and you're producing something that usually is rewarding, the scarf or the hat. If we think about that task, theoretically, there are probably several neurochemicals that are changed while you're doing something like knitting, if you enjoy knitting. So serotonin, research suggests that this is increased when you engage in repetitive behaviors like walking, doing some tapping your foot or your hand, or knitting. So serotonin can be maybe increased. Dopamine is involved in seeing something that's important, relevant, maybe rewarding. So that may be increased. I'll add a few more. There's a wonderful neurochemical, oxytocin. If we're knitting, or if you're knitting in the context of friends and talking and chatting while you're doing that, oxytocin is known as the cuddle chemical and is involved in some social bonds. I'm being overly simplistic, but that may increase. And then there's the stress hormone. The trained animals, I think I mentioned that they have lower stress hormones, but the stress hormones for humans is cortisol. And about half the individuals with depression have higher levels of the stress hormone cortisol. So anything we can do to reduce that is probably good. So as we're not thinking about your worries, whatever you're worried about during the day, and you're thinking about the stitches or chatting with friends or envisioning that the product of your effort, like the hat or the scarf, that is likely to reduce cortisol. You're distracted from the worries, the stresses of life. Maybe you're building confidence, you're looking forward to, you're anticipating the outcome. And we know that just anticipation will result in increased dopamine. So what have we done here in this simple task of knitting? We've changed neurochemistry. So this is what I refer to as behaviorceuticals, just a word I made up to suggest that our behavior, our activity, will also increase our neurochemistry, just as drugs do. But we don't have side effects that are noteworthy, and it's less expensive unless you have a real expensive hobby. But knitting is only one example, maybe woodworking or cooking. So we're building these connections. So there's a neuroanatomical basis to this, and that is changing neurochemistry. So it's more of a double hit as opposed to the single neurochemistry influence. So we need to, I think, expand our ideas about how we change this neurochemistry. It's interesting if movement is important, as rates of depression, unfortunately, just seem to keep getting higher, even though we have a multi-billion-dollar antidepressant pharmaceutical industry for this. Our lifestyle, if lifestyle is important, maybe it's because that has changed, and that is influencing the higher rates of depression in our society. Our ancestors, I have prehistoric Prozac, Prozac is an SSRI. Our ancestors were absolutely more active, and they built more of these effort-based rewards and finding food and building shelter and making clothes and having to be very vigilant about working for resources. So that movement may be incredibly important. As we think about our lifestyle and how we have become increasingly sedentary, as we have used our brains to produce solutions that make our lives really simple, we may be increasing the likelihood that our brains may get into trouble and have these symptoms of depression. It's interesting that in 1939, at the World's Fair, there was something that was introduced to the public. The television. And at that point in the New York Times, they wrote, this is pretty neat, but the average family doesn't have time for this because you actually have to sit in front of it and you can't work. You have to watch this. So for that reason, the radio is going to still be popular because you can work and do all kinds of things, effort-based rewards, while you are listening to the radio, and you're just kind of held hostage to the screen when we're watching TV. That was in 1939, and here we are. Not too long after that, a good amount of time has passed, but boy, how our lifestyles have changed. We have so many digital screens in our lives that we spend a lot of time, and that is decreasing perhaps our ability to build these effort-based rewards. So we need to keep that in mind. Even Darwin, when he was anxious about publishing his theory about natural selection, he wrote that movement and walking around what he called his thinking path at the down house relieved his anxiety. And if he was really anxious, he would dose himself with movement. And it may be a one walk remedy or prescription or two or three. And he saw real benefits, and as it reduced his anxiety. And anxiety is part of depression as he engaged in this movement. So I think we could take a few notes from our ancestors who were more active and be vigilant about the amount of activity that we have in our world and our lifestyle today, and think about some different ways of changing our neurochemistry so that we are more active and maybe building resilience against the emergence of depression. But we like to look at different ways that we can use behavior to change our neurochemistry and hopefully start to decrease the rates of depression. So let's keep those brains active in order to keep them healthy.